Hello. Seems like there's a lot of nice energy tonight. I want to add to Philip's statement and thank you for having us back. We're very pleased to be here. Our theme for tonight is enoughness. The topic is enoughness. How the notion of being enough, just as we are, might matter for each of us, and how that notion might show up in our practices. And I'd like to begin with a few lines from a poem that to me captures something essential about what we are moving toward or pointing toward in meditation. The poet advises us, work on becoming a native of mind, a native of heart. No thought, no feeling could ever be bad. Again, the lines are, work on becoming a native of mind, a native of heart. No thought, no feeling could ever be bad. The word native here means belonging to a person by birth or to a thing by nature, inherent. When we spend so much time in quiet reflection or meditation, as each of us here tonight has done, it is a given that we will be visited many times by thoughts and feelings and sensations that are uncomfortable or unpleasant or unwanted. Whether it's simply sleepiness, or whether it's regret or worry, or whether it's an old set of judgments or a familiar story, this phrase, work on becoming a native of mind, a native of heart, suggests that we view these internal experiences as natural, that they occur because we are made the way we are made. An important part of mindfulness is cultivating the skill to see these arisings as native phenomena, as the natural outputs of our minds and physiologies. When we can do that, we become able to view these experiences less personally. We learn not to identify with or become lost in thought trains or emotionally tinged stories, and we begin to be able to let go of shoulds and shouldn'ts, like I shouldn't be so tired or I shouldn't feel this way. And we can begin to let go of negative self-judgments. It's wrong of me to think about this. I'm a bad person for feeling that. So this theme that there's nothing wrong with each of us, that each of us is enough just as we are, invites us to allow our thoughts and feelings to be just as they are when we meditate. No thought, no feeling could ever be bad. To see them as temporary arisings generated by the natural functioning of our human being. One of the many aspects of these practices that's much easier to say than to do. You know how you sometimes read something that you already know, but it suddenly strikes you so differently that it causes you to see a familiar thing in a new way. And recently I read a sentence. It was a simple sentence. The sentence was about the simple fact that each of us breathes differently. That some of us breathe 12 times a minute, and some of us breathe 15 to 20 times a minute. And that however many breaths we take in any given normal minute is natural to us. What is the same is that we all breathe, and what is different is that there's no one way to breathe. So, why did this strike me so much? Because I think it's because I'd been thinking a lot about shoulds and oughts, and how even in this practice of meditation, Many of us think there's a way to do this and that we're not getting it right. And that also seems much more generally true, that somehow there's a way to do life, and that many of us seem to think we're not getting that right either. Being at ease with our native heart-mind is hard enough when we're practicing formally in our own private space or with others, but out in the world with our busy comparing mind, it is extremely challenging to give ourselves this allowance. I can remember when I was a teenager, and I was very aware that my friends and their families lived differently from mine. Most were from more affluent circumstances than I was, and I thought that there were rules, social rules, that they knew and I didn't. Sometimes just simple things let me know that there is this territory of unknown guidelines, like how to eat an artichoke. I'll never forget trying to figure out how to eat an artichoke. Something as simple as something that you purchased could be returned once you got it home if you decided you didn't like it. Who knew that? And my friends went to church and on youth group retreats, and my family didn't. What were those experiences like? What was I missing? So that sense of being on the outside, as if I was either a step behind or on the verge of making a mistake, left me looking outside of myself often for the right things to say, the right things to do. And there was always that sense that there was so much I didn't know, and the fear that I would blow it somehow. So as it turns out, I learned that faux pas was not such a terrible thing, and that violating some rule of social conduct wasn't going to mark me forever as an outcast. But along the way, I had created other kinds of rules that were much more binding and stunting and constricting. That notion that there's a right way to be, a right way to raise a child, a right way to be a wife. And if only I knew what those ways were, what those right ways were, if I read enough, observed enough, took enough classes, learned enough, PhD, my life would be easier, I could relax, I would not feel so at sea. So it's been a slow learning curve for me over the years, and I'm hoping that younger people today will have an easier time discovering that there's no one way to do things because they have the internet and Facebook, and everything is shared. Everything seems to be shared. And what is revealed through all of the information that's available, besides sometimes I think the confusion of too many options, is that there are many options, which helps put the responsibility for the choices, for assessing what's true or best or right for us, back where it belongs, on ourselves. So instead of searching outside of ourselves for what works, what fits, what matters, we have the freedom to find our own belonging. And that's what the phrase work on becoming a native of mind, a native of heart suggests to me. And the poet who wrote that line, Teddy Macker, in the same poem also wrote, "To know fully headlong, without compunction, the ordinary magic of our beautiful human bodies." The poem is titled A Poem to My Daughter. And in it, the poem is advising his young daughter, she's very young, he's advising her to live from her natural state, the one that doesn't struggle to fit into molds shaped by external influences, and the one that doesn't fear making mistakes. This is Maya Angelou. When people tell you who they are, believe them. Just as importantly, when people try to tell you who you are, don't believe them. You are the only custodian of your own integrity, she says. One of the first things that attracted me to these particular practices of meditation was the instruction that we were to rely on our own experience to tell us whether they were of benefit. Their value does not depend on any other criteria than our personal sense of their merit, how they are benefiting us. And a second thing that attracted me, certainly not the whole ball game, many things attract me, but the foundational belief that we already have everything we need to be more awake and more aware, more the whole of who we are. It is here, now, within us. We are enough. That native mind and that native heart are enough. It is discovering that native mind and that native heart that these practices are about. Discovering your natural rhythm of your breath. Accepting without resistance the natural flow of your experience. Noticing without attaching to or rejecting of whatever is happening within you. These practices also offer us the room to customize, to learn what works best for us, whether the anchor of the breath is right for you, or whether you settle more quickly with sound, whether you sit in a chair or whether you sit on the floor, whether you open your senses in a particular sit, or whether you choose to do a heart practice. It's such a hard concept, though, isn't it? The permission. That there's nothing wrong with us, that whatever is here in this moment within us, the good, the bad, or the ugly, is not a statement about our inherent goodness. That we can stop struggling to make ourselves something other than we are, that there's nothing wrong, that we can stop struggling. So we can take a moment for a brief reflection. And ask yourself, how allowing of yourself are you? How allowing of yourself are you? Do you, can you, give yourself permission to let yourself be just as you are? How allowing of yourself are you? Can you give yourself permission to let yourself be just as you are? So we'll sit for just a moment with those questions.
And continuing with the reflection, I'd like to invite you to say 3 times to yourself, I am enough. Perhaps with a couple breaths between each time saying it. 3 times to yourself, I am enough. And noticing what feelings, what sensations are arising in response to your saying, I am enough. Gently observing them, saying yes to them just as they are. Perhaps there's a certain resonance for you that comes out of those 3 words. Or perhaps there's a way that those words make you uncomfortable. And as is often the case for me, perhaps you're feeling both. Some resonance, some discomfort. A few years ago, a close friend of mine offered me the phrase, inherent enoughness, which was based on his own journey from a place of relentless external messages that told him he was not okay, to over time his figuring out that regardless of those messages, he was enough. This seems to be what our friend Tara Brach is referring to with her phrase, coming home to our true nature. And so my journey toward enoughness, as best as I can remember, began back in my freshman year in high school when I went out for the freshman basketball team. Years before, my dad had set up a basketball hoop and net at the end of our driveway, and I played out there again and again and again with my friends and practiced all kinds of shots. And he'd been a very good basketball player in high school, and he taught me a lot. And so I went out for the basketball team, and we had tryouts and practices for a week, and at the end of a week, they posted the list of the people who'd made the team. I did not. And as a rising freshman in high school, I was devastated. I was sure that I couldn't show my face in school the next day. And what could my life possibly be? And I realized that I was not enough, because everybody who made the team was somewhere between 6 inches and 18 inches taller than my 5 feet 2 inches and 90 pounds. No, of course, there was a little bit of fantasy going on there that at that height and size I might be a basketball player, but after all, I was 14. Not long thereafter, the wrestling coach suggested that I come out for that sport. And the structure of that sport was just right for me because they had a 95-pound weight class. And over the next 3.5 years, I had a great experience wrestling. I learned to do it well. I was successful, and very importantly, I learned a lot about myself, developed some self-confidence, and some discipline. And so I ended my my high school career and went off to college and thought that that maybe I'd check out the wrestling team in college because I was feeling enough. And so I went out for the wrestling team, and it was fairly clear to me right away that maybe I wasn't quite enough for this team. And in fact, my sense of that turned out to be pretty much on point when another freshman who was in my weight class, by the time he was a senior, won the NCAA championship. He was from Iowa, where they wrestle seriously. And so after that, that wasn't too bad. That didn't feel like not making the basketball team. But I finished school and I went off to work, and I spent nearly 30 years working in the banking business. And by any reasonable measure, I had a very successful career. I had lots of promotions, I got raises, they gave me nice titles, and they put me in a place of being able to influence what was going on in the bank. And I was well regarded, particularly as somebody who could make complicated things clear for everybody. And then the bank was sold. And I chose not to continue in the banking business. And in the weeks after it was sold, I began to think to myself, I'm feeling pretty free. And then I had this thought, I think I got out just in the nick of time before they discovered I wasn't really who they thought I was. And there was that imposter syndrome that creeps in from all of us from time to time. And because I was so influenced by social and cultural norms that were by definition external, I could never be enough. Now, social and cultural norms can be pretty useful in helping us understand how to interact with other people, with ourselves, how organizations ought to work. They're all good for that. But their value is more limited than how we generally apply them. For instance, in the business world, these norms are defined as being smart, accomplishing a great deal, and being charming. And each of these things in that environment is a way of putting a stake in the ground and saying, I exist. And if a person meets one or more of these measures of being smart, accomplished, and charming over time, then little else matters, including how people were treated on the way to these results. And yet no one can ever be enough by these standards. I think about growing up in the 50s and watching the Westerns on TV, and there was always this line, you think you're the fastest gun in the West? No, there's always somebody faster. There's always somebody smarter. There's always somebody who can get more done. And there's always somebody who seems to be more charming, which suggests in a way that we're all imposters. And Kay mentioned it a moment ago. It's comparing mind that puts us in this place, that leaves us feeling not enough. And again, even though comparing mind can be very useful in helping us navigate daily life, I mean, after all, I needed comparing mind to drive up here tonight, to figure out where on the highway I should be, how fast I should be driving relative to other people, when to exit the highway, etc. So it can definitely be useful. But we can never allow comparing mind to define us, to tell us whether or not we're enough. This view of not being enough is simply a construct of our brains, according to Rick Hanson, author of Buddha's Brain. He says, only we humans worry about the future, regret the past, and blame ourselves for the present. This kind of suffering, which encompasses most of our unhappiness and dissatisfaction, is constructed by the brain. It is made up. And what each of us makes up about ourselves largely comes from these social and cultural norms that are external measures, what Kay referred to as the shoulds and the should-nots. So, of course, the question arises, what's required to shift our view of our enoughness to allow us to appreciate our inherent enoughness? We can begin by no longer measuring our lives by being smart, accomplished, and charming, and instead turn toward living lives of well-being and meaning, and taking the time to define for ourselves what is well-being, what is a life of meaning, and doing that by turning inward, by mustering the courage and patience for serious, in-depth internal exploration, away from external measures, to sensing into how we actually are as human beings, to what is most important in each of us from the inside out. And yet, for many of us, what holds us back from internal exploration is a fear of our inherent human fullness, both positive and negative. A fear that we are so great that we tend to avoid our fullness and thus miss out on much of life. Kay gave me the latest book from poet David White for Christmas. It's called Consolations. And in that book, he's chosen 30 or 40 words that show up for most of us on a daily basis. And he's written about a 2-page essay on each one. And for those of you familiar with David White, you know he pulls no punches. He goes right for the critical issue. And he talks about words like despair, disappointment, hiding, regret, and says, if we can't incorporate what those words mean into our lives, if we can't sit with them, then we're going to miss the experience of being alive. And so what happens when we avoid our fullness is that we default to these external measures because they seem so much simpler and they're so much more available. We get pounded with these social and cultural norms all the time. They're right there. And in fact, they are simpler than doing the internal exploration. So what might support this shift toward emphasis on well-being and meaning? A big enabler for me has been the work that comes from the neuroscience, which tells us that we have these three fundamental functions in our brain that are there right from birth, that give us the capacity to live lives of well-being and meaning. The first of these functions of our brain is learning. Learning points us toward wisdom, toward seeing clearly, toward taking in our own experiences and letting those experiences inform us how to go forward by learning from them. A second function is self-regulation. And with self-regulation, this helps us with connecting, with caring, with cultivating compassion, these ways of interacting and being with ourselves and with each other. And the third fundamental function of the brain is selectivity, which is the ground of mindfulness, of cultivating awareness that has discernment with it. Now, I also like to think of these functions through a slightly different lens, which is that they give us protecting energies that literally protect us from physical and emotional threats and abuse. They give us connecting energies, which allow us to show up in the world in which we honor the interdependence in our capacities for love. And they give us awareness. As human beings, the capacity to be aware of what we're aware of. And so with these three basic capacities, is there really anything else that we need for well-being and living lives of meaning? As part of all of this, of working with these three functions, of fundamental functions of the brain, we can begin with mindfulness, which is about helping us to understand and observe our internal selves. Or as one observer has said, it is an antidote to our obsessive, even sadistic tendency to expect too much from ourselves. And of course, within mindfulness, we learn to pay attention to the Four Noble Truths, to the presence of suffering, to how craving and fear cause our suffering. And yet, there can be a cessation of suffering by following the Eightfold Path. And in mindfulness, we also learn about the three marks of existence: impermanence, suffering, and my favorite, there's no fixed, independent self. We are all in this together. And for me, being attuned to these realities of life allows the need to be smart, accomplished, and caring, and charming, to fade into the background, to dissolve as measures of enoughness. And we meditate. We learn to be observers of how we are, moment by moment, in our own lives. We learn about how life itself is. And we learn to just let ourselves be. And we learn to move away from the seductive power of comparing mind. We learn to appreciate the power that the conditions of being human that are beyond our control exert on how we think, how we feel, and act, and to forgive ourselves for them, which is a radical act that again moves us away from being controlled by the need to be driven by these external measures. And in meditation, we cultivate awareness, concentration, and kindness. And in doing so, we create the space that allows us to show up with considered responses versus automatically reacting. Recently, I had some insights into my current frontier of feeling enough. Over the years, I have avoided dealing with difficult situations with loved ones. I'm afraid that I'm not enough to avoid precipitating emotional chaos with the ham-handed way I might deal with a difficult situation. And for me, emotional chaos is a loss of control. There's a messiness that occurs. And it becomes obvious to me quickly, there's no way for me to fix this. And of course, how can you be enough if you can't fix things? Recently, some insights emerged for me about all of this in a conversation with my men's spirituality group. There's about 11 or 12 of us guys who have been meeting together monthly for almost 7 years now. And on this particular session, we were dealing with some Jungian material about the swamplands and exploring questions about fear, courage, and hiding. And so I took some time to describe to the group, to the other guys, my tendency to avoid emotional chaos. And I explained it in terms of what my fears were, where I lacked courage, and how I tended to hide from these circumstances. And as I talked it through, as I was saying it out loud to the group, and they were paying attention, it became clear to me that my fear of emotional chaos really had a couple of other fears underneath it. And one of those was a fear of disapproval, and the other a fear of incompetence, which are long-standing triggers for me. And as I finished my comments, there was a moment of silence, and then somebody in the group, I kid you not, men, said to me, "What about the role of self-compassion in dealing with all of this for yourself?" And when he said that, the light went on for me. That was the spark. And it became clear to me that these triggers around fear of disapproval and incompetence are from conditions beyond my control. I can forgive myself for them. And by turning toward my inherent enoughness, I realized that however ham-handed I might be in how I handle one of these conversations, that I will be coming from a place of my own enoughness and from good intentions to do something that's useful and helpful. And eventually all will be well, because life is not about fixing the messy, nor is it about avoiding what's messy. It's about being present again and again, and being willing to be with the pain and discomfort of life, and instead applying the practices that help us not turn pain into suffering.
Let's see if this, yeah. So, enoughness. Much of the intention to hold ourselves with that view has to do with our willingness to enter into a kind relationship with the energies of our human life, which is a phrase that I borrowed from one of Sharon's recent talks. But these energies of our human life was just what Philip was referring to. How do we hold these energies of our human life? Whether those energies are joyful or difficult. And to accept that what's important is not whether they are joyful or difficult, but how we are holding them. So for these last few minutes, let these words of John Wellwood linger with you. He writes, "Sit down wherever you are and listen to the wind singing in your veins. Feel the love, the longing, the fear in your bones. Open your heart to who you are right now, not who you would like to be, not the saint you are striving to become, but the being right here before you, inside you, around you. All of you is holy. You are already more and less than whatever you can know. Breathe out, touch in, let go." Sit down wherever you are and listen to the wind singing in your veins. Feel the love, the longing, the fear in your bones. Open your heart to who you are right now, not who you would like to be, not the saint you are striving to become, but the being right here before you, inside you, around you. All of you is holy. You are already more and less than whatever you can know. Breathe out, touch in, let go.